Now, if you've driven in a car recently, you can thank Daimler. It's actually a German uh, engine facilitator and maker who perfected the combustion engine that are used in most vehicles today. However, it was American innovation that took the idea of a combustion engine and putting it in an automobile and mass producing it for the market. So, yeah, while the Germans can take place for that, I think is Gottfried Daimler. So, like Daimler Chrysler, Mercedes Benz. Technically, Mercedes Benz was the first car manufacturer in the world, but they may have produced just a small handful of vehicles that could actually be roadworthy in the late 1890s. It wasn't until 20 years later or so that things made a difference. And you had American car manufacturers and designers like Henry Ford who would become the first American car manufacturers and be able to put American designed and American made vehicles for the open road or for your city streets or anything else like that. So, yeah, eventually, in the 1890s, Henry Ford first started up the Ford Motor Company. 20 years later, cars would grow significantly in the United States. We're going to talk about that here in just a minute. Okay? Cars were first produced and they were very tedious. Okay? But by the 1890s, you did have some vehicles made for American highways. Okay? If you have flown on an airplane, thank you, America. Wilbur and Orville Wright, two American brothers, first flew a primitive airplane in Kitty Hawk, North Carolina. And that was late 1800s, early 1900s. So, Americans, the Wright brothers, were the first to fly. Interesting. We're going to talk about some other flight milestones in future chapters. But nonetheless, America is building this idea that we are going to revolutionize how we're going to travel, both for personal or business use, how we're going to transport goods. We can do more than just trains. We can do more than just steamships, perhaps cars, airplanes. Okay, things are going to change. There had to have been an idea where these manufacturers had to continuously learn about how to properly use their product or how to perfect it or how to otherwise improve it and continue to improve. So the idea of some companies having a research and development idea came about in this era, in the early 1900s. We're learning to fly. How can we do this more safely? What are some things that we can identify now that could put more cars on the road? Because people shouldn't have to be on their horse and buggy all the time. Maybe we can invent various different things with infrastructure that currently exists that could make things better. How do we do that? You've got to have research and development for that. Frederick Taylor was an American who came along and advented the idea that, if we start putting together factories and maybe giving some of the factory workers a specialized role, then maybe, just maybe, we will be able to produce things faster and more efficiently. Okay? So, making production more efficient became known as Taylorism. And then you have that guy, Henry Ford, again. Okay? The first major American manufacturer of automobiles. He took note of the revolutionary changes coming along: electricity, Taylorism, specialization of the workforce. Okay, I had this idea that I am going to design an automobile. Can I make the parts interchangeable? Because if I can, that's going to be very, very efficient. Excellent. this electricity stuff. What if I kept a factory open all day and all night to continue moving product, and at nighttime I'm going to have these lights that would illuminate? I'm going to need my factory workers to see what they're doing, right? At night? Okay. You need electricity for that. What if I have this conveyor belt where you have a continuously moving product? I'm going to need electricity to power that conveyor belt. I'm going to need ventilation, one for ventilation, but also to keep impurities out of all my mechanical parts. Oh, and by the way, that Taylorism, yeah, there's something to that too. Because if I'm going to build an assembly line of vehicles, you're going to have people to be fast and efficient as possible. They're going to have one role. So if you've ever seen how vehicles are made on an assembly line, like there's a GM assembly line factory in Arlington. Assembly line workers nowadays work in conjunction with a lot of the machines that are producing things. People generally have specialized roles in an assembly line setup. Okay? Your job might be to install the steering column. Your job might be to inspect the paint. Your job might be to clip and control the machine to harness the body with the chassis or something like that. If you have a specialized role, you're going to do that role and you're going to become perfect at it. And then maybe you could learn another role to where if somebody were out for a day, you can take over their role, okay, temporarily, or at least maybe expand. But the other idea is with the advent of the assembly line, you are going to be able to produce large numbers of your product at a fast and efficient clip. And because the rolling on the assembly line, you have people with a specific role, things are constantly rolling, it's going to cost you less to produce your product because you're doing it in a far shorter time and things are way more efficient. That's going to drive all of your costs down. And if it costs you less to make them, you can make more of them. And if the costs go down, people are going to be able to afford more of them. And they're going to want more of them, which is going to keep you in process of keep having to make your product. Oh boy. The assembly line is going to revolutionize the world. And it starts with cars. It doesn't end there. Nowadays, you basically have assembly lines for airplanes, any particular product. You have all kinds of manufacturing all throughout the world that operates. You ever ordered something and it gets to your house in a while? It may not have been made right away, but it sure got to you right away. Okay? The assembly line changes efficiency to where in the early 1900s to buy a vehicle, Henry Ford, would cost about $925. That's a lot of money in like 1910 dollars. Okay, so 110 years ago, it cost you almost $1,000 to buy a car. Well, that's a lot of money for back then. Okay, within 6 years, that cost would go down to less than $300 for a better made product. Okay. What that's now going to mean is now more people are going to be able to afford this product. You're not having to pay $1,000 for it. You're paying more like $300 for it. Okay. That's still no chump change for back then, but that is far better than $1,000. And a lot more people are going to be able to pay that price point and work from there. So the assembly line has now made things far, far more efficient. Okay. Now, so Henry Ford develops the assembly line and General Motors soon follows. So you can thank, Ford, Chevy, for mass producing vehicles that would set the example for other car manufacturers over the world. America. Okay? Let's talk about corporations. Because nowadays you're going to start seeing the development of large corporations that are going to facilitate a lot of things throughout the world. That are going to wield a big stick and carry a lot of influence. So, even though you're starting to see larger industries pop up around this time, the automotive industry being one of them, it is the railroad industry that is the original large corporation. Okay, I'm going to say that again. It is the railroad industry that is the original large corporation. Okay, so even though you're able to transport things differently now, perhaps you're going to start working with airplanes and automobiles, whatnot, it's still rail that runs the show, that is still really big. And you have railroad companies around this time that understand the importance of laying more track. Between 1860 and 1900, about 5 times as much track was laid than what had previously existed. So now you can take things all throughout the country. You can take things easily from New York to Los Angeles and just kind of go from there. And as you can move things out, you can continue to move further out west. We talked about that in the last chapter, moving west. You have things that are supplied getting to you now. Now it's efficient. Okay? Which also begs the question, in the Dallas area, we live in Central Standard Time. Who came up with the idea of time zones? Why are they important? In New York right now, it's an hour ahead of us here in Dallas. In Denver, it's an hour behind us. In Los Angeles, it's 2 hours behind us. Why did that happen? Why is that important? Well, the way the Earth rotates and moves, it's nighttime in the other half of the world, and it's daytime in our half, and vice versa. Okay, it's not the same time. You don't have the same daylight hours operating at any specific given time of day. It was the railroad industry in the United States that advocated the idea of there being time zones so that they could have start and stop times that would be consistent with the day schedule. It was the railroad industry that came up with time zone standards. Okay? America. Otherwise, though, you have Andrew Carnegie, the steel magnate of Pittsburgh. He was an Irish immigrant, a Scottish immigrant, but he made his mark in the United States from nothing and built Carnegie Steel, which at one point would monopolize 2/3 of the entire steel industry, especially because he was located out in western Pennsylvania. Andrew Carnegie became exceptionally wealthy in the steel industry. Otherwise, though, you have J.P. Morgan, with whom Andrew Carnegie would sell his assets for $400 million back in early 1900s money. $400 million is an ungodly amount of money today. $400 million 115, 120 years ago? Okay, that's like Jeff Bezos, Bill Gates type money. Okay, yeah, you're exceptionally wealthy. Money will never be a problem for you. Okay, so he sold his business that way. You have the advent of major corporations that are starting to come up around this time. And in order to compete in the marketplace, several different things would happen. You have the concept of horizontal immigration and vertical integration. Horizontal integration is the idea that a company who makes one product or does one thing will acquire another company that does the same thing. And they merge assets and they become basically one company. So they're no longer competitors, they're now the same entity. Okay? You see that a lot, like today in the cell phone industry. T-Mobile and Spectrum merged not that long ago. So they merged their capabilities, they merged their clientele, they merged their product lines, and all of their technologies. Okay. Nowadays, because you're no longer competitors, you play for the same team, now you can really step up and hammer away at Verizon and AT&T. Okay. So you start to see that happen. That's horizontal integration. And you're expanding your business that way. Vertical integration might be the same company, but instead of making just one product, Now they're going to be involved in several different processes and they're going to make multiple different things. You saw this especially with the oil industry. Um, John Rockefeller, Standard Oil, at that time the world's largest oil company, believed in the idea of vertical integration, which meant that you weren't just going to produce, extract, and refine oil. Nowadays, to make it more uh, efficient, you are going to buy companies that make steel barrels, that can produce steel boxcars for you to take on railway. You're going to buy various different railroad stations or companies. You're going to become involved in other different aspects so you don't have to pay somebody else to ship your product or anything else along those lines. So basically, you're just adding to what your company is capable of doing as opposed to just buying more companies the same way. The idea of horizontal integration and vertical integration changes the business landscape because now it is at this time you're really starting to build very large corporate entities. So many of the world's largest corporations that you see today, they got their start around this time. It was the railroad industry that became the very first big major corporation and corporate entity. Others would soon follow, but a lot around this time were not exactly thrilled with the idea of there being cutthroat competition. The more competition you have, the better it is for us, the consumer, but it makes things sometimes hard for the business. So that's where some other things have to come into play to make sure that things are still profitable. Sometimes government benefits go to companies to keep them afloat because at that time you have salt miners in Michigan who were at heavy odds with one another because, well, they were outpricing each other and nobody was making a profit. So they had to come to some sort of agreement and form various different alliances to say, hey, we're competitors, but if we regulate prices, we can all make a good mint and stay afloat, all while being fair to the consumer, ideally, right? Okay. Otherwise, though, it was around this time that you start to build the idea of there being companies that could possibly grow too big and form monopolies. As companies concentrate power, it becomes important to be able to harness that power and do something about it. So the idea of competition could actually become very important. But you have to be able to manage a sustained economic growth overall without there being monopolies. So more discussion goes into that. But otherwise, the United States becomes the world's largest industrial manufacturer in this era. Good times.